Alrighty, so we are going to be starting our new unit, Evolution and Classification. And the first part of this unit is talking all about the origins of life and where life really kind of started and came from and how we get to the life that we have today. So, very first thing we need to start thinking about is, how do you think that life on Earth began? And there are lots and lots of different theories out there. There's lots and lots of different beliefs. So this is kind of a cool opportunity to think about how you believe that life began. And then we're going to kind of look at the science and the scientific evidence behind what scientists believe. All right, so first theory that we are going to look at is something called abiogenesis. Okay, and if we break down the word, and I love to break down some words. A means not, bio means life, and Genesis means creation. You can think about the first book of the Christian Bible, Genesis. All right, so abiogenesis is basically just this idea that life started from non-living matter. All right, so our early atmosphere, Earth has had a couple of them. So the very first atmosphere on Earth was very volatile. It had lots and lots of gases in it. There was no oxygen to it. And so our very first atmosphere of Earth was blown away by solar winds, and it was replaced by the atmosphere that we have today. So our understanding of some of these early conditions actually comes from some of these scientists. And the first one is Alexander Oparin. And he developed this theory that basically said that inorganic compounds, remember these are things that do not have that CH and O bond, all right, could become organic molecules like carbohydrates and proteins and nucleic acids and lipids, the things that we talked about in Unit 1, due to these violent conditions of early Earth, okay? So Earth was extremely hot. It was super prone to severe lightning storms. And what this theory is called is a theory of the primordial soup. So basically, the oceans had all of these inorganic compounds in them. And Oparin said, hey, I think that lightning and heat and meteorite impacts and stuff like that are causing some chemical reactions to occur, which then are causing our inorganic compounds to become and change into organic compounds through a chemical reaction. All right, the next set of scientists that we study are two guys, Miller and Urey. I'm going to move my little picture here over to the side, all right, so that we can see the diagram over on the right-hand side of the screen. So Miller and Urey basically created an experiment to test this idea of the primordial soup. So they tried to recreate the conditions of early Earth, and what they realized was that they could actually take inorganic compounds and turn them into organic compounds in the form of proteins. Now, this does not mean that they created life in this experiment. What it does prove is that they could take inorganic things and turn them into the basis for life. Okay, so they are not snapping their fingers and all of a sudden creating life. That would be the idea of abiogenesis, and we just don't have that. Okay, so life has to come from other living things, and scientists have proved this over and over and over again. All right, but what we realized in this experiment is that we can make the building blocks for life. So potentially kind of talking about and trying to prove how life came to be on Earth. Now, of course, nobody was around. We don't know for sure. So these are all scientist theories and hypotheses that have been tested and discussed and everything over the many, many, many years of humans wondering where we came from and where all of this stuff on Earth came from. All right, when we talk about the origins of life, we also have a theory of biogenesis, okay? And if we break down the word again, remember that bio means life and genesis means creation. All right, so biogenesis means that living organisms must come from other living organisms. And the two guys on the screen are ones that have to do with this particular theory. So Francesco Redi and then Louis Pasteur. So once again, life must come from life. So this was proven by Redi, proven by Pasteur. We're going to look at two different experiments that they both went through to prove this theory over and over and over and over again. All right, so if we take a look at this experiment right here, and it looks kind of gross when we start looking at it, but basically, put some meat in a jar, okay, and we cover jar A with a paper towel. Jar B has some meat in it, and then the top is left open. Well, what we notice is some flies are starting to come down and land on this meat, just like flies land on any food that you're kind of leaving out in the open. Jar C has the meat in there. It also has a gauze on top. So think about something that's like a mesh. All right. The flies are not getting through it. All right. But they're leaving maggots behind. And maggots are just baby flies. It's the beginning stages before they sprout wings and become adult versions of themselves. Okay. So if we see what's happening in A, B, and C, this is actually going to start to prove our idea of idea of biogenesis. All right, so Reddy and Pasteur, basically both of them disproved this idea of abiogenesis. All right, and they did this with these two experiments. They did this with the rotting meat, and they did this with another experiment called the S-shaped flask experiment. Okay, so we have, I can make myself a little bit smaller. That would be perfect. Okay, so in jar A, we've got this meat. It's covered up. Nothing can get to it. All right, so there are no maggots inside. Jar B, completely open. The flies are getting in. Maggots are starting to appear because the flies are laying eggs in this rotting meat. The maggots are starting to grow. This one, partially covered up, so they were like, oh, maybe the air was causing the maggots to form. All right, so this one is letting air in, but the maggots are still just on top of the gauze and not actually in it because the air is not making the maggots, the flies are. This experiment kind of does basically the same thing, okay? So this is the S-shaped flask experiment, all right? So they took a flask, this glass container that we use in science, and it had this long, thin tube off to the side, all right? And they sterilized it by boiling it, getting it to kind of clean itself, all right? And then we have one flask that remains unbroken, so it remains sterile. And then they broke the neck of the other flask, which allowed air and other things that are in the air to actually go in. Now, the broken flask became contaminated after exposure to all of this germ-laden air, all right? Whereas our one that was sealed off did not. So once again, proving that things come from other living things, organisms come from other living organisms, all right? So basically, what we're trying to say is that life began through this theory of abiogenesis, where we had these inorganic compounds, they turned into things, the building blocks for life. But now that we have life, all cells have to come from pre-existing cells through the process of biogenesis. All right, so let's take a look at this particular question and then answer it. All right, so once cells have gotten their place on Earth, all of a sudden we have, all these different theories. Okay, well, how have cells evolved from where they originally were, what they originally were on Earth 4.5 billion years ago when Earth was formed, or a little bit after that when life came to be, all right, and how we get the cells that we have today. So when we talk about evolution, one of our huge terms that we're always going to discuss is mutations, all right? And mutations produce new varieties of cells that actually coexist. So our first hypothesis we're going to look at is something called a heterotroph hypothesis. And this basically just states that the first cells were unicellular, they were simple, and they could not make their own food. So a heterotroph, if we break down that word, hetero means different, and then troph means food. So they actually had to consume other organisms for food. So our first types of cells on Earth were prokaryotic. They were anaerobic. If you remember what anaerobic means, that's when they were going through cellular respiration without the use of oxygen. And they had to be able to do this because there was not a ton of oxygen in the atmosphere. And then they were also heterotrophic, going along with our heterotroph hypothesis. Our second type of cell that scientists theorized to have evolved was a prokaryotic anaerobic. So once again, very simple, unicellular, not using oxygen, but it was autotrophic, meaning that it could make its own food through photosynthesis. Well, we know that one of the things produced during photosynthesis is oxygen. So all of a sudden we have all these different cells that are autotrophs, and they're starting to make their own food. They're starting to produce oxygen. And what this is doing is actually changing our atmospheric composition at the same time. So when we're releasing all this oxygen into the atmosphere, we've got tons and tons of it to work with. All right, so if you think about it, once again, they were anaerobic to start with, but now we're starting to get some oxygen in the atmosphere. So that's going to lead us to our third type of cell. And these third types of cells are prokaryotic, aerobic, because there's oxygen in the atmosphere, and they are either autotrophic or heterotrophic. So they were both. Well, one was one was the other. So we can go ahead and fill in that. So we got prokaryotic, heterotrophic, anaerobic. We've got prokaryotic, autotrophic, starting to release that oxygen. We've got prokaryotic and aerobic, and we've got eukaryotic, heterotrophic cells. All right, let's look at our next theory, which is our endosymbiont theory. And this is a big giant name, basically just explaining how we got eukaryotic cells. So if you notice the last slides, we were talking all about prokaryotic cells, things that were very simple. They didn't have a whole lot of organelles inside. They just had that cell membrane, some DNA, some ribosomes, some cytoplasm. All right, these aerobic prokaryotes actually turned into mitochondria. And our photosynthetic prokaryotes started to be turned into chloroplast. All right, so our evidence to basically support this theory is that chloroplasts and mitochondria are the only organelles that actually have their own DNA that's separate from the DNA in the nucleus. We talked about that with mitochondrial DNA before, but did you know that chloroplasts have their own DNA as well? All right, so if we think about that, we've got two organelles. They've got their own separate DNA. They must have been their own cells at some point in time. All right. So these larger cells engulfed these smaller cells, and then basically they have a symbiotic relationship with these cells today. All right, so eventually this is leading to the development of multicellular organisms like animals, like plants, like things that are much, much bigger than our unicellular things. So let's take a look at this question. Go ahead and answer it. All right, and that wraps up our notes for the origins of cells and cell evolution. All right, we are going to be moving on later in the unit to talk about evolution of species and the mechanisms of evolution and just how exactly we got to have all of these different, millions and millions of species that we have on Earth today.